everybody. Welcome to the Bertec Knowledge Series. We are recording this webinar. We'll be posting parts of it or perhaps all of it on our YouTube channel in the next week or so. So you can look there if you miss any parts or if you want to share it with friends. Thank you all for joining us. We're excited today to be kicking off a 3-part series with Dr. James Onati. This has been a long time in the works. We've been wanting to work together for a long time, and we're finally doing it. So we're very excited. This particular webinar is on Newton's first law in biomechanics, the law of inertia. So hi, Jimmy, how you doing?
Great, thanks for having this. I'm excited. This is fun.
We're excited too. We always have a great audience, specifically and definitely for this kind of a subject matter. I feel like everybody gets really excited to talk about this kind of stuff. Hi, Fernando.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm back.
Great. You're back. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just share with you all the mechanics of how this all works. If you haven't joined us before, we don't allow you to turn on your cameras or unmute yourself, but we do encourage participation through the chat. So if you open your chat function in Zoom at the bottom there, you can ask any questions you have of Dr. Onati throughout the webinar, and even during the pre-recorded presentation while I'm playing that. That's the best way to assure that you get your questions answered at all, because we may run out of time and then you have a lingering question for him. We will also have time afterward for a live Q&A for a little while there at the end. The presentation will run about 21 minutes, and I'm about to play that after I introduce Dr. Onati. So Dr. James Onati is an associate professor at The Ohio State University in the College of Medicine. He's the current director of the Movement Optimization and Prevention for Exercise Sustainment, MOVES, Research Laboratory, and is the interim director of the Division of Athletic Training. His main research focus is developing research paradigms that bridge the gap across research to clinical systems to allow for evidence-based outcomes for aiding individuals to sustain optimal health and performance throughout their careers and lives. I told you I would stumble on it at some point. I warned him. His research has been sponsored by organizations including the National Institutes of Health, Office of Naval Research, Department of Defense, United Special Operations Command, and the National Athletic Trainers Association Research and Education Foundation. Dr. Onati is an associate editor for the Journal of Athletic Training and is a reviewer for several sports medicine, biomechanics, athletic training, and rehab journals. He's currently the chair of the National Athletic Trainers Association Research and Education Foundation Committee for Athletic Training Research Agenda. He is a fellow of the National Athletic Trainers Association and is a member of the Youth Development Committee for the American Baseball Coaches Association, which is focused on high school age ball player development. So there you go, only stumbled once, not so bad. So with that, we're gonna kick off the presentation, and I'll ask you guys to turn off your cameras and mics, and I'll share my screen and we'll get going here. Please ask any questions you have in the chat.
All right. My name is Dr. James Onati. I'm an associate professor at The Ohio State University in the Division of Athletic Training in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences in the College of Medicine. Welcome to Human Movement Biomechanics for Rehabilitation Specialists. This is a part 1 series on Newton's first law of motion, and we'll go through Newton's 3 laws. So let's just start off with what is biomechanics. A lot of times people put in these different words and different ideas, and we really just need to kind of define these things as very, basic ideas. Dr. Hay in 1993 defined it as the science concerned with the internal and external forces acting on the human body, right? So we're really talking about engineering within the human body and the effects produced by these forces. So we're going to get into those definitions a little bit and really think about the understanding. So what is this biomechanics? And we see all these angles and we see these ground reaction forces in Newtons and force equals mass times acceleration and all those things. But really, when we break down the words of what biomechanics is, bio means life. And we're all doing that right now, trying to do our best at living our best life. And then motion. And when we break it down to those simple things, we're really just applying our motion and our life pieces to the human body. So let's just think about in general what we're trying to do here and thinking about the concept of human movement. So why should we study human movement? Why should we understand biomechanics? And that's just one component of human movement. And the idea is to really facilitate improvements. Some people are in performance enhancement, some people are in rehabilitation, some people are in coaching or education. And an understanding of human movement and the factors that go into it are really important to understand how to achieve the best and optimal performance for as long as people can. So teaching expertise, I think there's individuals who really think of them as human movement instructors or human movement teachers. I think all rehabilitation specialists are obviously within the human movement side of things. We have movement specialists that go into these areas, and then obviously exercise prescription or movement prescription on these things. So let's look at this paradigm of just injury risk, and I just broke this down into a couple of different parts, right? So we have a theory on these parts, and you can see the neurology and the environment, physical characteristics, behavior, with psychological aspects and history, right? So we know that one of the big things for injuries has always been the history of previous injury. So are they recovered from their previous injury? What, if an individual has had a previous injury, is it fully at strength? Is it fully at range of motion? Has it reconstructed its neural system, so on and so forth? Let's just kind of look at one of these things, and we're just going to take the environment as an injury risk and think of this about human movement part. And so you can see this variety here. We have some military soldiers doing some different blast type of activities. We have military soldiers looking at some different virtual reality aspects. We have an individual going through rehabilitation here at the bottom and looking at playing this kind of video game, but in reality, they're just controlling their posture and doing a leg lift. We have a football player getting tackled on the sideline with some constraints on the sideline, trying to stay in bounds, trying to go score a touchdown, while the other football player is trying to not allow them to do that. You see the individuals in this soccer component. We have a ball that gives us a goal, a directed goal for our movements. A lot of these things can lead to our injury risk and lead to our processes of how we're going to try to impose our movement patterns and our rehabilitation. So there's a lot of different things within the movement side that we really need to kind of understand. And I just picked out one from the environment standpoint. So let's define movement. If we're so really involved in trying to be instructors and teachers of movement, it involves a change in a place, position, or posture relative to some stationary frame of reference in the environment. A very basic definition of movement. So let's just look at that. We just moved on this screen, and we're going to go back and forth. What happens? It's all relative to what our perspective is. Right now, we have the bar here that we can see that is starred. That is not moving. The words are moving relative to it. And so when we start breaking down biomechanics into this, complex situations of all these Newtonian motion laws and all these parameters and these equations and all those things, the very first thing we need to think about when we're talking about movement is understanding the basics of place, position, and how we assess those things. So this is one of my favorite. So this is Bruce Lee. For those of you who aren't Bruce Lee fans, Bruce Lee was about 5'8", and the individual on the left was Lou Alcindor, otherwise known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was a basketball player. And he was not 5'8". He was listed somewhere between 7 foot and 7'1". So you have an over a foot difference, and you can see Bruce's kick getting ready to go up. And this is a great classic movie. But understanding movement in this fluid fashion is just one component of it. And we can really concentrate on Bruce's side of these things. But the reality is, look at all the tense posture, look at the hand position, look at the head position of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in this motion, and look at the athleticism in the body that's kind of ready to move out of the way of this kick, or to, in the movies, take the blow and make it look as close as possible in this piece. It's fascinating to understand not only the movement that we have here, but the biomechanics that go into this. And that's really what we're here to talk about first. So I really like to think about rehabilitation specialists. I don't really think about it as any of the alphabets of, A, B, C, D, whatever's behind your name. let's just think about the rehabilitation model, and let's just think about the movement model, and let's think about the biomechanics knowledge. So we can have a variety of different things to be able to assess movements. We have laboratories with motion capture, and we have some great force plates and those things that happen to come from our sponsor here, Bertec. We have ability to be able to look at cardiovascular capabilities and really air exchange. And air exchange is a movement. And being able to measure that amount of air exchange. We have down here looking at our fMRI aspects, and we can look at the brain signal, and we can look at blood flow and blood oxygenation levels, which is our bold statement. Those are a biomechanical movement of oxygen into certain areas of the brain, and looking at those levels helps us decide where things are when we create movement. So I don't want to just think about movement in one aspect of biomechanics is only into the force plates or only into the motion capture. Movement happens at so many different levels. And then just think about it from the other aspects, the clinical performance integration. You know, we all don't love working into this world of a laboratory based, and in my opinion, the whole world's a laboratory. We have individuals doing jumps from boxes, and we have some very simple marks on them. The only reason that we know these angles is by position information. We have a big, large weight room, and we can see. We only know that we can lift a certain amount of weight because we see one position to the other. And biomechanically, we have some certain techniques to try to aid them in performing and trying to prevent injury. You can see on the below picture, we have an individual, two sets of individuals doing some cone agility runs or some different aspects of that. We only know and can judge their pieces from the movement patterns that we have. Those are all based on, again, a variety of different aspects. So when we think about movements, I want you to think about some complex movements. You can see in this upper left, a football quarterback stepping back to throw and doing that throwing pattern. You can see a soccer kick into this right side. You can see a tumbling piece in the middle. And every time I click on it, it seems to go off. So I'm going to stop clicking on this. And you can see some cut and runs and some balance. Those are fancy because we have equipment that can really highly measure the amount of forces and the amount of movement that occurs. But we also have simple movement assessments. You can see us jumping down and doing a box drop jump onto a force plate, and we can get force plate analyses. You can see us doing different movements here, an instructor going through proper push-ups in camp here. And you can see these movements here. This is their resting position. They're not allowed to rest anywhere outside of that. And then you can see the functional movement screen. And there's many other screens out there that have different movement categories and capabilities. So now let's just kind of go into something that this is Dr. Clifton now. He was one of former doctoral students that we looked at for injury risk identification. And let's just think about these things. And this is just a simple parameter for looking at injury risk. And you have test X, whatever test that is, and then you have injury, and you have some error within those pieces. So now you have a Y balance test, a movement test that basically measures how far you can slide a little slide piece in the anterior direction. And then an error, right? And then we have the injury. Can we predict injury from the Y balance test? Then we have test X, again, whatever test you want it to be, with some error in those things, because every test measurement has some error. And then Y balance test. So how much does test X give us information on Y balance test? And then we have, looking at these things, if we go all the way across, now we have some test X that predicts a Y balance test that predicts an injury. And thinking about those things in those parameters is really how we're kind of utilizing some biomechanics. Just because you have high forces that you land doesn't mean that you're going to get injured every time. Just because the elbow goes into a position doesn't mean every time they throw they're going to have an elbow injury. Just because you land in valgus, your knees collapsing in, doesn't automatically mean that you're going to have an ACL injury. There's components that go into it. We have to think of these things as multifactorial components in movement whenever we are thinking about movement instruction or rehabilitation. So one of my favorites is the anterior cruciate ligament. This is just for a little review, this is a knee ligament that is primary importance. The cost is very high. It's usually a surgical intervention, not for everybody. And the problem is we also have a high rate of secondary injury, and we can get into a whole bunch of factors on why, but that's not for this talk. And of greater importance is that we can see deterioration as they get older with knee osteoarthritis. Now you're limiting movement, and that's a difficult task for many people. So let's think about the function of the ACL, and I just want you to think and see this video. And this individual has a right knee injury, left knee injury. You have to guess right there. And it's which one is it? Now you can understand which one is it. And you can see him grab his knee right there, and you can see it buckle in, and it's a left knee injury. It resists the anterior translation of the tibia. It is handling the knee motion when we're running. And you can see that no individual had hit him, but there was constraints there. The constraints of the sideline and the constraints of the individual coming in. And you can see that he didn't want to keep on going out of bounds and wanted to come back in. And that created a demand on his leg, and it created a demand on his body. And then it resulted in this unfortunate injury. But we have to think of the function of the ACL, deceleration, landing, control, as movement parameters. We have to think of biomechanics in these pieces. So I really want you to understand this is another individual who injured their right knee, and this occurred last year. Think of the load that this individual is taking on that leg. Well, there's biomechanical concepts that are at play here, and understanding those things as movement specialists is going to be very important in your understanding, career, and information. So I'll give a little bit of how I kind of view and picture the concepts of human movement. So we first have to have some activation. And in this activation standpoint, we got to be able to, and activation can be a muscular activation, it can be neural input, it could be a visual input, and obviously vision's in the neural aspects, but activation doesn't just have to be muscle activation. It could be an activation of a demand that we're required to respond to. And then we have to create some type of stability to be able to create this activation response to those things. And that stability could be, we lean on our hand to be able to stand up and sit up. It could be that we grab a hold while we're on a bus to create stability, another point of contact in those stabilities. And we need to be able to have mobility as our next piece to be able to have the capability to move and do the demands that we are trying to respond to. And then the endurance factor, we got to be able to do those things repetitively or for a long period of time or for a short burst of time, but at a high intensity or a low intensity. We have to be able to move in a variety of different ways for us to control what we are doing in space. And so I just give a little bit of a primary kind of background on these things. And this is a little bit hierarchical kind of concept of how do we define different ways of assessing motion. And I just gave this is, your cost is all relative. Everybody, for some less than $500 is nothing. For some less than $500 million is nothing. I'm not one of those people that less than $500 million is nothing. But in primary movement assessments, the cost is lower. The training is minimal. We don't need a tremendous amount of certifications. We don't have a lot of processes that are regulations over assessing those things. And the time component is relatively minimal. Now, again, some people are going to say, well, 15 minutes is really a lot of time. And in other people, 15 minutes is a very short period of time. So I don't want you to get wrapped up into those things, but a primary assessment is really a low level assessment. The next step of those things is a secondary assessment. So let's just think about these things. Again, the cost is where your company, where your clinic, where your personal costs are. And it can be somewhere in between the 500 to 10,000. That doesn't really matter, but it's a secondary it's a step up above your primary, and you need some training. Doesn't mean that you need to have a tremendous amount of regulation, but you need to have attended some information. And the time, again, is relative, but it's somewhere above minimal and less than a tremendous amount of time. And understanding the next level is tertiary. So you're going to do a large, extensive type of review. it may require expensive equipment. It may require some extensive training and certifications. You may have to have state law to be able to allow you to do these types of assessments. And it's just a really different level. So whenever we're talking about movement and assessments, I just want you to think of primary is very minimal, very quick, secondary is in the middle, and tertiary is a really extensive type of care. So if you think about it, hospital care, a tertiary hospital unit is a specialized unit to be able to provide highly specific information. And I just really want you to think about Newton's law as just about position and force. And we're going to talk about Newton's law of inertia today. And there's a variety of different ways you can kind of state this, but we'll just kind of go into this definition of the basics definition. A body will remain in a state of rest or constant motion in a straight line or in a direction unless acted upon by an external force that changes that state. Otherwise, we can say a body cannot be made to change its speed or direction unless acted upon by external force. And it's a little bit difficult to prove on Earth because we still have some other things that are going to be able to try that: friction, air resistance, so on and so forth. And remember that movement, what we see, is not the only movement that's occurring. Right now, blood's flowing through us, a tremendous amount. We have neuroelectrical impulses that are moving. And so I really want you to think about those types of things, not only from a macro piece, but from a micro piece also. So let's apply Newton's laws first in a clinical fashion. Let's just think about the law of inertia here. And we have some pictures of post-ACL rehabilitation process. And one of the very first things that we have to do is create knee extension. And within knee extension, we have many factors that inhibit the ability to create knee extension. We have pain, we have inflammation, we have fear, and we can look at these types of things and go, okay, well, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to create knee extension. Well, let's think about some different ways that we overcome inertia to be able to do that. We can create a smoother surface. So right now, this individual has a sock on. We could take a sock off and create any type of smoothness there. Now, with that, it's going to also create a higher demand of control to be able to go out into knee extension. We could create some type of force that helps us push down and creating that type of response to it and thinking about those types of things. We can also consider different neurological aspects that influence movement and influence the ability for us to overcome inertia. You can just look at the traditional classic arthrogenic muscle inhibition model and think about how that influences our response and our reciprocal inhibition processes have a neural component, obviously, to it. So the law of inertia, trying to get either something to move that isn't moving or something to not move that had been moving, is a basic concept of movement ideas. So understanding the law of inertia, Newton's first law, is the center point of everything that we do in these really extensive tertiary biomechanics assessments and everything that we do in these very simple primary biomechanics assessments. It's the first law of motion, but it's a law that we need to make sure that we understand very well. It's a law that we have to utilize in our parameters for providing an environment for success or for challenges. A lot of people like to think of Newton's second law and third law as the actual laws of motion, but you need all three to really understand. And this first law of inertia is so important on this part. I hope you gained a little bit of knowledge of how this falling apple and Sir Isaac Newton's influence on us as rehabilitation specialists, movement coaches, whatever other name you want to deem it. But understanding that an object in motion stays in motion, an object at rest stays at rest, all unless acted upon by an external force. So I love Sir Isaac Newton's statement, if I have seen further than others, it is standing upon the shoulders of giants. We have giant information out there. We have many knowledgeable people. Hopefully you're seeing this and trying to take advantage of your next step in development. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much, Dr. Onati. That was excellent. A great basis for your whole series, and relating it to sports is so applicable for our audience. So thank you for that. I am going to toss it over to Dr. Santos to lead the Q&A now, and we have a couple of questions submitted in advance. So I'll let you guys handle that.
Hello, everyone. Let me just be sure that I'm not muted. I'm not. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. This part one is definitely you laid out the structure for all the other parts and other webinars that we were doing in the future. I wish we had a lot of biomechanists, like one-on-one students around here. It's really useful for them, and not just for them, but for clinicians too. Well, I was expecting you guys to have more questions there, so I'll be waiting for questions. But while this is not happening, we talked a little bit about that before, but you talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary assessment, and how do you decide what assessment to do, what assessment system to use when you're talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary?
Yeah, so I think, it all is dependent on the situation, right? So it all depends on the detail of analysis that you need. So for me, it's thinking about them in a medical environment, right? So you don't always need to have, let's just take an example, blood pressure being a screening assessment. If I have high blood pressure, it doesn't automatically mean that I need to go to a tertiary cardiac care and get open heart surgery right away. That would be a very expensive, highly specialized, urgent situation. So, and it's going to take a lot of time to do that. So I would say the same thing. If we're trying to do some simple measurements of a patient or a athlete in a quick environment, then we can really look at some of these primary measures or secondary measures. If we really want a detailed one-on-one, we have 8 hours with this individual, we can really get into a higher level. And if we have the equipment and we have the knowledge and we have the skills, we can do those things. So I think it's really dependent on those and those ideas.
Nice. I will go back here. Someone is asking, how can you test inertia on the Bertec? I would just go back to you and say, how do we test inertia?
Well, the thing is that we're always in a constant state, right? So if you're assessing any type of movement or activity right off the bat, you are testing inertia in that environment, right? So we are always constantly battling and utilizing and involved in inertia. So any postural control measurement, any force or jump landing measurement, any movement of any type is basically within the inertial properties of our movement. Then what constraints do we have that are influencing that? It is definitely going to be considerations there. So we got some more in the chat. Maybe I'll just read some of the questions in the chat.
Oh yeah. Yes.
So first off, I want to thank everybody for watching and for staying, and Bertec for being involved. This was supposed to be a basic discussion of Newton's foundation. So this wasn't meant to be a paper, new knowledge and those things, but really to try to make sure that people aren't forgetting, and especially students and clinicians aren't forgetting the basics. And I think we have to sometimes get with the basics because we sometimes move too far forward too fast. So Cynthia, thanks for your question. How important is it to understand what people do when assessing an injury? Like you're looking at the shoulder range of motion and a low back injury in a working person. Okay, so I think what you're getting at is what accessory motions go on within an injury. I think what you're trying to get at is an individual with a low back injury, could that be related to the shoulder demands that they have going on? So maybe it's a factory worker, or maybe it's an athlete, and they're trying to get into a position, but they're lacking shoulder range of motion, and they try to extend that by creating more trunk rotation or flexion to be able to do their either repetitive job or their sport or activity. And I think that's an important part, is we have to look at the primary area of injury, and then we have to look, I really think we got to look head to toe and all around that area. So from an ergonomic standpoint, from range of motion across different joints, from stability and mobility and endurance capabilities at different joints. So I think it's very, very important on those aspects. And that's really where we start getting into, well, what assessment tools are you going to utilize to capture all that information? Great question. All right, that's all I see in the chat right now. So,
All right, I always mute myself, but well, another question just came by.
Carson, how often do you see groups ignoring the effect of constraints and assessments? Would this impact previous knowledge in the field? Example, constrained step lengths on force plates versus constrained speed on instrumented treadmill. All the time. I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to understand is that, our life's full of constraints, right? I mean, we're full of constraints right now. We're all on a Zoom call instead of being in person, and it helps in some ways, right? Some of you are in parts of the country that I would never be able to get to or reach. Like I'm in Ohio, and I know some of you are in Virginia. Some of you may be in another continent. So we can look at those as positives and negatives. I definitely think some constraints are not involved in assessments, right? And it changes the movement pattern. I think sometimes the constraints are involved in the assessment and it changes the movement pattern. We have to just understand what we're trying to achieve and understand also the parameters of what we're trying to achieve. So, the width of the force plate and the size of the individual. That's one. If we're running to jump and we're running to cut, and we have a very, very small force plate that it is set up in a situation that has a very small run out. Well, it's tough to do a run to cut and back up to speed in that situation. So we may only be limited to being able to do, a postural control demand or a vertical jump. And we got to understand that we may be constrained just not only by resources, but by our environment. And our environment isn't just on the field and in the lab. It could be our environment in that we are, constrained to a smaller research lab space or a smaller clinic space. And we got to be able to understand how that affects the movement pattern.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I would just add a little bit here that constraints we will find in any place that we're going to test it. So it's really important to understanding what you are testing and understanding what those constraints will do to the task that you're having right now. We talk about, just because we talk about force plates and treadmills here, one thing that we talk sometimes is about the targeting, right? Like if you have a force plate and you want to measure something and you have that targeting, that people will try to step on that force plate. That's a constraint, but it depends on what you're measuring, right? It depends a lot of what you are actually measuring. Maybe that is not a constraint to several types of measurement, but it is to another one. So that's also the difference between why use a force plate and why use a treadmill. Those are different by itself systems and environment that you're able to do different testings to them, right?
Yeah, I think you're right on, Fernando. And I think also we have to think about our constraints outside of just environmental constraints. So, size
Yeah.
of the force plate and surface and room, but also constraints that we put on for goals. Do we want to do this movement as fast as possible? Are we trying to do it as accurate as possible? Are we trying to achieve, what's our motivation for the movement? Is it so that they pass and can go on to do something else? Or is it so that they can, achieve a contest in a game and they're trying to treat? So we have to not only think about the physiological constraints, but we also have to think about the psychological constraints and what are those parameters. And oftentimes biomechanists, movement specialists, they do what they are comfortable with. If you're an engineering background biomechanist, they generally look at all the physiological constraints, and the psychological constraints aren't imposed. If you're more of a psychology, movement, fear, those types of things, they don't think about some of the biological, physiological constraints. So I think it's a really great topic to consider, and taking those into account is very important.
Yeah, it is. Oh, we have one more question.
Yeah, so we got, are there new and better braces or devices that spread out the forces to prevent injuries? I'm not a big proponent of braces devices for knee injuries. I don't keep up with that. That's not really my research area. I'm sure there are some. I really have become a big proponent of increasing somatosensory capabilities. I was not a big believer in the aspects of things like leukotape or these really nice sleeves or brace sleeves. But I do think that there is something along the somatosensory area of warmth to a joint and just feeling of that we have some type of material that either gets stretched or not stretched, and that enhancing our somatosensory capabilities. I haven't done research on it myself, but I have turned the corner in that I was doubting those things. And now I start thinking that there's some interesting components to that somatosensory information upregulation that could be helpful for injuries. So, ankle bracing or knee bracing and so on and so forth. So I do, again, early in my career, I did not believe in those things because I was just coming at it from a pure biomechanist standpoint, and that's not resisting the force that we really need. And now that I've really added the neuro side of things, I do believe that there is some unique part to that. So, another question: how can we best bring the research lab to the field events? That's we just have a slew of different things that we're working on, from IMUs to markerless systems to visual upregulation capabilities for clinicians, meaning, we have a lot of stop motion cameras that are high speed. I think we have a lot of different things. I don't think the equipment is the problem. I think it's the logistics is the biggest problem. And our equipment gets upregulated on a regular basis. Every year, it seems like we're advancing. The issue becomes, how do we create the implementation systems for time, for effort, for data reduction, for reports and analyses, for storage of information? That's more important. So I think we really need to embrace the implementation scientists that are out there, the data scientists that are out there, because I think from a tool standpoint, we have a lot of really unique, good tools for both primary, secondary, tertiary assessments. It's just a matter of logistics on a lot of these pieces. So, great question,
Great.
Kathleen.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Any more questions? Once, twice. We have a couple more of pre questions that were sent before the webinar, and I know our first one was about first law in inertia. So I'll send you another one here about that. Oh,
I'll let you take this one. Can Bertec create a simulation of falls in human subjects? So that I'll let you go on that, Fernando.
Okay, I'll go on that. So it it depends of how do you want to simulate that fall, right? If you go to the realm of multisensory, we're talking about visual, vestibular, and proprioception. You can stimulate or simulate falls using one of those three systems, right? We do have systems that will simulate fall in utilizing your visual system, and you can simulate fall also using proprioceptive or somatosensory systems with a couple of our products. I'll say we're trying to not make this much as a advertisement and sell products here, but short answer is yes. And what I will tell you is please send us an email, get in touch with us, and we can give you more information about. We'll have later on the year or beginning of next year, we'll be presenting about, we'll be doing a couple webinars about a couple of our products. Then I'll go more in depth, and one of them is the immersive labs that is just behind me here. And then we can talk more about that. But yeah, send us an email and I'll send you more information about it. Thank you, Del.
Okay, very interesting question. So Cynthia, I used the Bertec force plate to explain the importance of exiting large trucks facing inward instead of stepping off stepping correctly. Also, why jumping off platforms and back of trucks is so hard on the body. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that you're using it as an education tool to demonstrate to people of how this is 2 times your body weight, this is 3 times your body weight, right? And I think that's kind of probably the the way that you're using it and getting individuals to understand if you do that over and over and over again, what are you doing to your knees and your low back and your ankles and so on and so forth. I think that's a great use, because now instead of just using it as a tool of assessment, which you are doing, you're using it as a feedback tool. And I think we don't think of biomechanics and we don't think of Newton's laws enough along those lines of as a feedback tool. And I think that's a great piece of information. It's it's a nice way to re-emphasize the importance, because if you show a PowerPoint slide and say, when you jump off, you're jumping off at 2 to 8 times your body weight, depends on how you're doing it, right? But they don't really understand that. And then you try to go and show them that they don't really understand. Then they show the value of what they're doing, and you show them 2 different ways. I think it's a great instructional method.
Yeah, I have to say this is really interesting. This is really interesting, and I think this is this is the I really good research, really good work. Thank you so much for doing that. What I can tell you, I use force plates for clinical before with amputees, for example, right? And people oppose knee surgeries and all, and it's way easier to tell. It's easy to say to a patient like, oh, 50% of your 70% on the right and left. And when I used to teach about that, I used to tell the clinicians, okay, stand here right now, give me 80% on your right now, right? And it's without a feedback. There's how do you measure those kind of stuff? So I do like this side of giving this biofeedback, this live feedback to people. And yes, it's really nice when patients see that they want more, right? And it goes back to what you said before, the logistics of it. We have so many tools around there, but the logistics, the post-processing, and how we're going to work and actually show to people, that's something that we need to work on that.
Yeah. And Cynthia, also adding to those pieces is, you start explaining some of these basic physics, and sometimes they sit there going, well, I don't know physics, but they really do. I mean, they really understand. So say your large trucks, they really understand the physics of torque. They understand you know, we're going to do the next one. Part 2 is going to be force equals mass times acceleration. They really understand that when they apply it to their trucks, but they oftentimes don't think about it when they apply it to themselves. And so I think that it's really nice to take your basics of movement and basic physics knowledge and apply them biomechanically. And I think it's a great way to relate to your clients, patients, you know, athletes, whatever it is, for them to understand that.
Well, you will talk about levers another time, but truck drivers most definitely know about levers too. Tell them to change their tires. Will they go with the little tool and that little arm, or they go with a really big arm to get it? So right there, they know levers, and levers. You know, teaching biomechanics, you know that it's not always students that get actually levers, but you using your daily life for so many things, right?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you know, I also coach high school baseball. Kids start understanding inertia when they put too much weight on the bar and it doesn't move. They understand that, and it really sinks in, and they really remember it, and then they start realizing, oh, I do this on a regular basis, and I understand my physics. And I think that's the biggest thing that we need to do with also our patient-based, client-based, athlete-based, is for them to really understand the importance of these pieces and the, you know, the foundational parts of the work. All right. Let me see. Okay, so I see somebody saying yoga really helps their patients doing center of pressure, FMS. Very cool. And it's funny, I'm starting to do more yoga with my baseball players now, and I do see a tremendous increase in stability and endurance. I did not realize how much. I just started myself 2 weeks in. I didn't realize how much endurance, physically and mentally, yoga would be for me. Um, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. So maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I know it's helping. And some of these simple movements that I see yoga folks do are not so simple. All right, so Carson, you're saying, so you are emphasizing that it's important to include patient feedback in the design of any rehab system. Biofeedback becomes useless if the patient can't understand it. I don't know if it becomes useless, but I do think it helps them if you can relate the information to them, whichever way. Some will really be science focused, some will not be science focused, but however you can get it to them about what they do know, I think is important. And so things that they do know. So, you know, if you're talking to, uh, you know, I don't know, Carson, give me maybe a patient or an athlete or a client based background, and I can kind of use that as example. But I think you're using basic science foundations to create the emphasis of what interventions and feedback that you're trying to give, and then you're trying to relate it to them. That's kind of the purpose of these 3-part series of Newton's laws, is how do you relate the basics of motion, and then going that to your, you know, clinical framework, patient framework, client-based framework, however you want to do that, you know, education in the classroom framework for students to understand. So.
Yeah, that's a great opportunity to teach patients, right? I've always been telling all my silent clinicians here that you should not just go and treat it. You have to teach your patient what is happening, why this is happening, and use simple terms when they're necessary. But is a going back to people saying they don't know physics, but they use it every day, and they do know. They might not know the big words and the big names, right? But they do know, and they see happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it empowers individuals to understand that we're not just throwing out exercises, we're not just making up movements, we're not just making up numbers. There's science behind this, and I think for some people it really provides a level of comfort for them to know that there are scientific basis for their training, their rehabilitation, their assessments, so on and so forth. And I think that's the valuable part of making sure that we know the basics of what we're doing as rehabilitation specialists or coaches or instructors or teachers or so on and so forth.
I do like this word a lot, empowering. Like every patient, every athlete that you teach them something new about biomechanics or how is reacting is so interesting how they want to tell this to everyone. And they want to pass this over because they learned that and now they understand their body and they want to tell other people. And it's so interesting to hear that and to see that happening, right? So that's empowering is actually is a great word for it. Yeah. Any more questions? No? Oh.
Yes, Alina, I think that's how you say your name. So thank you for the thanks. Sensory rehab is a much needed intervention. Common rehabilitation practices seem to rely mostly on purely mechanical means. What sort of trade-offs must be we wary from the use of these devices, extra interventions that would help compare the effects on a particular condition? I could not agree with you more that it is a combination of mechanical and neural or musculoskeletal and neurological or all the, we love to separate bins, you know, biomechanists over here, exercise physiologists over here, engineers over here, you know, you name it. I really think the neurological aspects of movement is really coming either back around again, if you know, depends on what around again is for you, or increasing and really kind of melding. I think we always have to be careful of the interactive effects of mechanical and neurological aspects. And I think we, you know, I always use it as, so for me, I'm a simple person, simple IQ, simple mind. For me, I always think about building a house, and the house is really the mechanical pieces, but it doesn't work if there's no electricity in the house. None of your fine things for you know, lights to refrigerator to all those things don't work without the electrical, which is the neurological pieces. So I think the neuromechanical pieces have to always be considered in unison and in a give and take type of piece. And how do those things influence each other? The mechanical demands, constraints, demands, so on and so forth, and the neurological input or lack thereof. You know, I love, you know, maybe there's some orthopedic surgeons on here, and great. I love what you do from a mechanical standpoint, but oftentimes do not consider the neuro side of those things. So we can put together an ACL back, but we don't have any of the neurological components. So how do we do that? That's some of the research that we're trying to do. And if anybody's out here and does that area, love to talk to you. But I think that's that's definitely the missing pieces to the next evolution of rehabilitation jump, is assessing the neuro plus the mechanical all interwoven, and then how do we create the best paradigms for individuals. All right, so Cynthia's got pushing or pulling. I try to teach not to pull backwards, but turn around and pull while the body is in a set posture. Hose over shoulder walking forward to save the problems of inertia, or hose moving up or too fast or getting caught up. For me, it you know, it's also dependent on the situation. I think you got to be able to push and pull in all different areas. But is there an you know, is there a mechanical optimized position? It seems like you're talking about hose pulling for maybe firefighters or that type of piece. That's kind of what I'm getting caught up on. I think you also had the truck question there. So I would say you got to evaluate it from a both ways standpoint. I think you know, you're starting to talk about posterior chain if they're pulling. You start talking about anterior chain if they're pushing. Which way is going to be best? I think you know, again, that's not my research area. I would say we got to go evaluate them both and see which one is going to be the most optimal, but also the most clinically relevant. So what I mean by that is if it's walking forward, but is the turn a really problematic problem or a situation? So is it the turn where we see rotational injuries and low back injuries? And is the turn, if the turn is a weak spot, but we know they have to turn to be able to go from there, well, can we do something to either avoid the turn? That's by walking backwards. And are we going to offset trade? Yes, the push might be better than the pull, but how much is the turn going to cost us? So those would be questions that I would have on that part. So I don't know, and I don't know from a logistics standpoint. And then you also have to think from a historical standpoint, right? How do these firefighters learn how to do their things from their previous firefighters? And so and most of the time, what is the reasoning for it? Usually it's either the faster or the easier, and it's not always the same way. What I mean by that is faster isn't always safer.
All right. I'm budging in. This is an excellent conversation. I think all these questions were fantastic. And I mean, you really started something here. One of the things that I think was really interesting that you highlighted, Dr. Arnati, was that the importance of embodying a teaching persona, like with your patients and your research subjects. And in order to do that, you have to kind of remind yourself of some of these basics of Newtonian principles. And so I love that you're highlighting that for us in this series, because I think people can really apply that by then teaching people the importance of doing things a certain way. It's really neat.
Yeah, I think we always get wrapped up into the latest, greatest, fanciest, right? And I do too, and I love that stuff. I love, all the newest, latest gadgets. I mean, we have a lot of them, and we have a lot of yours. And I love those things, but we also still have to go back to basic mechanics, basic instruction. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from. I always have a slide, and I didn't put it in this one. I learned almost everything I need to know in life in kindergarten. Listen, share, always have food to eat, things of that nature, right? So I think that's important for clinicians to always remember the basic foundations, right? You may have all the knowledge, but if you're a poor communicator, then learn how to communicate better. You may not be a physicist or scientist or biomechanist, but understand the basics of that are things that you apply every day, and so on and so forth. So yes, definitely an educator, teacher, helper model.
Yeah, and part of that communication is putting things in your other person you're communicating to, their language. So understanding the application and their job and what they're trying to accomplish. So yeah, it's all great. So thank you so much. This was wonderful, and we're excited to look forward to your second 2 parts.
All right. Yeah, I this is fun. This is a blast. People can reach out to me on any of the emails and stuff. I love thinking, talking. This is my why. I love giving advice that hopefully helps somebody.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do what I love doing on a regular basis.
Of course. Yes, always. All right. I'm going to plug our next 2 webinars, and then we'll sign off. This is perfect timing. So the next webinar we're having will actually be part 3 of Dr. Joseph Clark's series. This one will be on depth perception training for athletes. So if you're on this webinar, you might be interested in joining that as well. And his first 2 parts will be on the YouTube channel. The second part is a little late in getting up there, but will be up within the week. And that's on December 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then on December 15th, we'll have Dr. Arnati back for part 2, and that will highlight Newton's second law in biomechanics, the law of force. Is that how you would say it? The law.
Force equals force equals mass times acceleration. So the law of acceleration.
Law of acceleration. Okay, great. Thank you. So we have these new 3-part series we're doing, and I hope that they're useful to you because they kind of build off of one another. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks, Dr. Arnati. Thank you, Dr. Santos, and we will see you. Thank you all for joining us and your great questions. We appreciate it. Come back next time. Goodbye, all.